I think we can start. I just want to say thanks for joining. Janet, welcome. Very nice to see you here. And welcome all of you again to our third kind of seminar. It's really lovely to have seen in the past while how you've been connecting up with one another and doing your thing. It was lovely to get your annual, what's not your annual, listen to me, your your 6-month report in to see all the stuff that you've been doing. It's been very interesting to put that together. So that's been sent off to the NIHSS. Let's hope that that will be good enough for them. And I think that there's been a lot of activity if you put it all together. It's very exciting. So anyway, I just wanted to say that. So thank you all for doing those reports. It was made my life very easy because you managed to do them quite in detail. And yeah, I think maybe without any further ado, lovely to see you all here. Thanks for coming also, Vulindlela, for stepping in for Jenna. Jenna's pretty ill at the moment, so she wouldn't be able to make this, but Vulindlela acting as co-host for Abigail, we thought that would make a lovely pair, and Vulindlela is always wonderful to have you here.
I'll do my best. Thank you.
Okay, so maybe we should start off with okay, does anybody have a burning desire to go first? It would be either Abigail and Vulindlela or Mvuzo and Joseph.
Well, I haven't done this before, so maybe someone else could go through and I would see how the respondents actually are supposed to.
Okay, how about then Mvuzo and Joseph? Let's have you go first.
And then we can go second, Andrea.
Yeah,
yes,
I can break the ground. I'm not sure if my respondent is ready to come along to break the ground.
I
no,
think
I'm
so.
right here along with you, Joseph. So let's do it.
Yay. All right. Joseph, would you be able to put your camera on when you do your presentation?
Let me try that.
Perfect. Yay.
Okay.
All right.
My topic it's exploring, or is an exploration and assessment and assessing actually the usefulness of oral literature in the 21st century, especially in secondary schools, looking at the CAPS curriculum with reference to Bakwena Bamogopa Glen Praise Poetry. The discussion of this article is demonstrating the difference, not the difference, it's demonstrating the similarities between the Totokiso, which is modern poetry, and the Toko, which is praise poetry. To say if the Totokiso, modern praise poetry, is given a platform to be assessed into the school curriculum, why is it not the case for the Toko, which is praise poems, not to be assessed? And it argued that the revisionist approach will be adopted in this argument, and precisely because it says the CAPS curriculum must be revised, simply because in the Totokiso, the modern praise poem, we don't have much of a rich language in them. And for one reason, in the Toko, there's a rich language in that, because the images that are used in the Toko are more powerful to an extent that the deconstruction theory by Norris says the poet is able to give supplement or to give something that is not there. Say, for example, you talk about the land praise poetry of Bakwena. By virtue of saying Mokwena or Bakwena, the image of a crocodile comes into mind, even if the crocodile is not there. But with the Totokiso, it's something different. And that is where Upland argues that oral literature is the Cinderella of the anthropological studies. Now, if Opland is arguing that, it therefore means that there is no need for oral literature to be scrapped off from the curriculum by virtue of it being part of the anthropological studies. And it means if that is the case, that oral literature is scrapped off, therefore it means there will be no anthropological studies in the future, because somehow there's a relationship between anthropology and language. It has its own history somewhere else. And for one reason, there is that grade against a relationship between oral literature and anthropology. And that is the boiling point of the article, to say justice is not done when we consider oral literature as an erstwhile subject and fail to understand that it could be seen as inter and multidisciplinary study that can find its rightful place in the scholarly circle in the world. If for example, if we are to argue, and if this article is to argue, if KFC, McDonald's, and Coca-Cola, they are in a position of giving the modern flavor and repertoire to the customers and make them happy, why can't we bring the same flavor and repertoire to our oral literature, to give it flavor to the learners and the teachers who must teach the oral literature in our school curriculum? And whether the reader will agree or disagree to say oral literature, for it to survive in the 21st century, it must be treated really as inter and multidisciplinary study. And we should be vocal about it, to say, where does it take our education system to? Apart from the education system part of it, there are great benefits for oral literature to be kept in the school curriculum. For example, when one has to look at the cultural identity, the article argues that praise poetry is a cultural trademark and watermark that is engraved in the DNA identity of every African child. So if it's engraved as a DNA identity, therefore why should we scrap it? I think that is the argument, to be brief, because I understand that we're given 10 minutes. It's 5 presentation, 5 for questions. I'll pause there for questions. Prof?
Okay, Joseph, thanks. Wow. That was very well on time and very kind of concise. So what we will do is ask Mvuzo to respond to you, and then we'll open it up for questions after that. Okay, so Mvuzo, let's hear from you.
Hello, sorry, I think my computer sometimes just does funny stuff.
Yeah.
So sorry about that, about the delayed response. I'm just trying to find my note for Joseph quickly. Good afternoon to everyone. Good to be here, to be in session. I found Joseph's notes here, because this is a draft of an article. I found them to be interesting, lots of interesting ideas. But I think you're going to have to forgive me, Joseph, because I think my response is more critique than anything, because I think that's part of the job here. And I think firstly, I think my biggest critique of this work is the fact that it's so rich. There's so many ideas, and I think and therefore it lacks focus. And so I could, for example, I think I pulled out 4 or 5 different arguments that are being made here, and not any one of them is sustained at any length or depth. And so from your and this problem, I think, is evident from your title itself. I would propose that, for example, the part in the title that deals with basic education, I think I've already removed it, so that's why I'm a bit lost. So your title reads, Exploring and Assessing the Usefulness of Oral Literature in the 21st Century in Secondary Schools Curriculum based on Bakwena, Bamahop, Clan, Praise Poetry. What I did was to remove the part about schools, all right? And now it reads, Exploring and Assessing the Usefulness of Oral Literature based on Bakwena, Bamahop, Clan, Praise Poetry. I think it's there's a whole argument and probably need to be entered around the usefulness of oral literature, of orature, sorry, to canon, to literature itself, and then you can bring in clan praise poetry, and I think then to extend that argument to the need or the necessity of schools or praise poetry to be included in school curricula is probably a different paper in and of itself. I'm not too well versed in terms of, I think you made a distinction now between poetry that's currently in schools and the one that you're advocating must be so you'll have to forgive me, I'm not too well versed in terms of what's currently there, what's currently in the curricula, but I do think that there's two different arguments here, and you might be well served by recognizing that there's so much going on, and you might be a need to make one argument in one paper and keep the other ideas for maybe another paper, 2 or 3 papers. And you mentioned it now in terms of the importance of orature to anthropology, and hence the need for its need to be a subject in schools. I think I had a bit of a problem with that, in the sense that I can understand the value of orature in anthropology, but I'm not too sure if that same argument extends to it needs to be in schools. It needs to be taught as a subject in schools. Ethnography is something that methodology that I use a lot in my own research, right? I could possibly argue for the value of this discipline. But then I think it's a bit of a stretch if I want to argue that it needs to be adopted as a subject in school. So I think just pay attention to those jumps. I said I think that still connects to what I've just initially said. In the sense that maybe too many ideas to be dealt with, and I think you need to find that one central problem or problematic and deal with that and its attendant issues. I think I will have to summarize some of the notes and just click on what's important. But I think it's the point that I made, that is I just recognized it's just way too many arguments, and we need to just pick one and maybe go with that. I think in the end, there was, and then I think in the end you got to the bit about the clan praise poems, and I think this is then the most pressing concern. Your paper needs to deal with this as the issue, is lack of recognition. Because another note that I made, for example, we mentioned the fact that poetry could be used to tackle social issues, not even socio-economic issues, social issues in South Africa. And I think that argument needs to be made. Then there's an argument for the importance and intrinsic value of his poetry to the identity of individuals and students, and without running the risk of being essentialist and generalizing. I think that itself is also an argument that needs to be this orature is important because of identity issues and all of that. So as I said, I think I keep harping on, and this is why I want to bring my response to a close, because I think in essence it deals with the fact that there's a lot of threads, and I think you just need to maybe limit to one, find what is most important, because there are very, very interesting ideas. There's a lot of potential here. I think I just need that one note to be centralized, and then I think a deep understanding and analysis can follow from that. All right, that's my response.
Okay, Vuzo, thank you. That was an excellent response. We had, I don't know if everybody had a little bit of, well, I certainly had a little bit of trouble with sound quality. So I'm not sure if everybody got everything that you said. As far as I can summarize, it was really a matter of saying there's so many ideas in this article, and that there does need to be a kind of a focus on one, and that perhaps, I mean, this was what crossed my mind, was perhaps there are 3 or 4 articles here, something about identity and praise poetry, something about the echoing of socio-economic issues, something about the anthropology, something about the curriculum. I'm not sure if I got everything Vuzo said, but
yes. Sorry about the sound quality. I think that's the gist of my response. Thank you, Andrea.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So I think, shall we maybe ask Joseph to respond, and then we'll open it up for a question from the floor.
Thanks, Prof. I am taking credit of the comments made by my respondent. But I think maybe the point where he might have lost it is the discussion. It's just a clear demonstration. We demonstrate that there is these great relations between Ditothokiso and Ditoko. And now I'm trying to argue to show that if in praise poems, there is a great relations with anthropological studies, therefore it has a place in the curriculum to be tested. And that argument, it's not necessarily saying I've put many ideas. It has a way of arguing to say, with praise poetry, there is a lot that one can gain, including the question of cultural identity. To say, as Africans, we are culturally identified by our glands. Like in my case, I belong to the crocodile gland. So if you are to address me correctly, you have to say to me. That's the cultural identity. And for one reason or the other, it becomes the DNA identity of every African child. So I'm not sure, but maybe Vuzo can write his comments and maybe we can have a discussion so that he would understand the perspective from which I am coming from. Because including the element of curriculum to say, the curriculum has scrapped it off. And once it has scrapped it off, it means it has scrapped off again the cultural identity that is engraved biologically when you are born as an African child. Maybe the discussion that could not be paged into towards the end of this article is to say, when a child is born, a praise poem is recited to connect the child with the ancestral spirit world, to make the ancestors of the family aware that so-and-so is born. When the child is taken to the initiation school, praise poetry is the case. When the child gets married, praise poetry is the case. When we graduate at the universities and we have an uncle or an aunt who attends, he or she will recite a praise poem to tell the peers and the audience to say who this person is. So there's a whole lot of it. but maybe it's a discussion for another day. But my respondent is to say maybe he might have misunderstood the perspective from where I'm coming from. Because
okay,
thanks.
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm looking very carefully at the clock here, and I just want to open up for one question from and then we will have to move on a bit. So anybody got a kind of a burning question that you'd like to ask Joseph?
Nothing at the moment, Andrea.
Okay, then I would like to just very briefly. I'm very interested in your use of the Derridian term, the supplement. I think that seems to be quite an interesting because or an interesting angle to take. I mean, a supplement is something that is very paradoxical because it basically assumes that the thing is whole without the supplement, but also that it cannot do without the supplement. So it's a very kind of strange term. So if you're thinking of oral literature as a supplement, it's an interesting use. So I was wondering if you wanted to comment a little bit on that, just for like a very brief comment, a minute or two.
Thanks, Prof, again for taking me on. I think if one is to read deconstruction theory by Derrida, but I have a book written by Christopher Norris.
Excellent.
He says many a times in a text, you will find supplement of words or of things or images that are not there. But as a reader, those things comes into mind. And that's where also where imagery comes in, especially the visual imagery comes in to say, if somebody else says, I belong to the Ndlovu land, the elephant. So obviously the picture of the elephant comes into mind. It's a supplement. So you are supplementing things that are not being said by visualizing them. So I think that would be my take to say. It's also supplement, I mean, oral literature has the element of supplementing words or things that are not being said, but by virtue of you listening or reading, some pictures comes into mind. So you will have those visual images that comes into play. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right. Thanks for that. I see we're kind of almost on our 20 minutes, so maybe we should end there and maybe ask Mvuzo to present. Perhaps speak slowly if you can because of the sound issues, and we'll see if we can muscle through.
Okay, I'll try to do so. I'm not too sure if my video is going to affect this.
Perfect. That looks good.
A bit dark, sorry for that. So I'm presenting on the project that I am currently busy with Belinda Ploy, which is an engagement project. And so what we basically are doing in the project is it's research and the creation of scholarship about engagement work that is being undertaken at NMU. So it's just because most of the time engagement work is very practical and fails to, it's not even a failure, but oftentimes it does not extend and become scholarship. So the project is then the attempt of converting what we can and maybe also, excuse me, and maybe also just creating guidelines in terms of how what are the possible routes to take in terms of converting scholarship into converting engagement work into scholarship. I'm just having a difficult time with the camera here. if it's not a problem, I'm just going to switch it off if you guys don't mind. Our first case study was in the sciences. It's called STEM Pipeline Project, which is basically the subjects of maths, the sciences, engineering, technology, right? And so there was an intervention. This is the subject. I think I need to go through the subject of the first paper, the draft of that is something that Linda and I are currently working on, and that's in development. This particular presentation is based on the paper that follows, but I think I need to go through what our first initial paper was about, and then I can go on to the gist of the second paper. So the first paper was this kind of overview of what the project is and what it was about. And the finding that I got from reviewing is all the material was there. We were provided with the record of the STEM pipeline project from 2010, 2021, essentially. And so the job was to review the reports and then figure out the scholarship creation work, what form it could take. And I think one of the core points that I then got to was the fact that grounded theory as a methodology was a good vehicle to the work. And this is because of the fact that the material, as I said, was already there. And so what was left then was to figure out what the hypothesis was, because I think you had to kind of inverse what research normally is, which is you lead with a hypothesis and then you go on to collect data that will either prove or disprove whatever you thought the case might be. But in this case, the work is there, and so grounded theory was very useful in terms of providing the thematics that you let the data lead you to whatever you let the data lead you along whatever path. Okay, so so that's a note on methodology that was used in the first article. And then one of the main findings that I got to was the importance, basically, if I distill it, was the importance of the broad definition at NMU of engagement, because in many universities, and certainly in the universities that I've been exposed to, the engagement work is termed community engagement, right? And I think the specific case of NMU and the context around the university necessitated, I think, a broader understanding of engagement, which can bring in industry. And I think, and so the important, I think, finding that then the paper gets to is the fact that this broad definition, which can bring in, instead of terming it community engagement, understanding it as engagement work, allows you to bring in industry, and you can understand why that is the case with NMU being in Beja, and with the fact that there's so much industry around, you can pull in that resource. And that was important. Sandral teaming up with the STEM subject areas, and this very useful and productive engagement intervention was then developed, something that has legs. It's been in existence now for 12 years, and certainly something I'm sure has certainly the evidence points us to that has been very useful. So quickly now getting to what the second paper was about, and it will use the same methodology, grounded theory, because it's only in reading the data that the second paper, the idea for the second paper also came about. And that then is about the progression of the project, because it started as intervention into the intervention centered on grade 12 learners, and they had to achieve a minimum of 65%. And then the first year, what management of the project then realized was that there was only low 50% of students. There was a minority of students actually getting 65 to qualify for the project, for the program, the intervention. All right. And only 10% of that class was going to qualify for further study at universities. So as it proceeded throughout the years, and this is just a case study on how they changed, for example, minimum requirements in order to qualify for the intervention. There's various other strategies that were adopted throughout this tenure of the project, because they were responding to different problems as they arose. And so, for example, what happened with the criteria is that they extended it to grade 10 learners, they extended it to schools that were not achieving, learners were not achieving 50% in science and maths. And the reason why it had to be, you had to go to a grade 10 level is because the earlier that you quote students, the better their marks could be. And so the program was widened in the sense that it wasn't just students who were getting 65% that were considered anymore. It was those obtaining below 50 as well. And it was further broadened to grade 10 learners. And as the program developed, it went as far as to a grade 3 level, right? So I think that is going to be the main point of the second paper, how the project has shown development, and that development has come about because of response to problems that have emerged with conducting the work. So it fits within this grounded theory approach, because as you go along, as you experience things in the field, you have to respond to that, and I think the project is a good example of that being the case. So I think I'm going to leave it there. Thank you. I hope I was more audible this time.
Yes, Mvuza, great. That was for me at least very clear. So thank you very much. So let me go directly to Joseph for his comments, and then we'll open it up.
Thanks, Prof, to take me on once again.
Can we get a video
presentation? Like him, I will certainly critique him. I think, Prof, can you hear me?
Yes, would you be able to put your video on?
Okay.
That would be lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, I was saying I will be critiquing him as a scholar. Maybe there are some points that he can take with home to reflect on my comments. The first comment goes on the title of the project. Is very quiet, it's silent. It's just a STEM pipeline project, and what about it? For some reasons, it could have been ideal, in my view and my poor thinking, to say a STEM pipe project, a good model to improve maths and science in grade 10 to 12, say supposedly, so that we would understand why STEM pipe project it's a burning issue for this article to be taken on. Secondly, it's the acronyms that are being used, which I'm not saying it's a problem, but for a person who is not familiar with such acronyms, it might be quite difficult for the person to come along. Say, for example, I'm not sure whether STEM it's a name or it's an acronym, to the consistency of the NMU and NMMU. They've been used interchangeably as synonymously or whatsoever the case may be. But let me go to the actually nitty-gritties of my comments. One, I could not get the argument quite correctly to say if the STEM project intervene at a critical juncture by offering curriculum-based physical science requirements and investigation to grade 10 to 12 physics learners, how will the STEM have that kind of intervene? Are they saying they are developing maybe a kind of a study guide? Are they developing a kind of a supplementary curriculum to the current curriculum that the Department of Education is offering? I'm not really sure as to how will the STEM, how will the project will intervene in this critical juncture by offering curriculum-based physical science experiments and so on and so forth. Two to that is to promote and develop mathematics and physics. The word develop is like there is no maths, or maybe I'm taking the word develop mathematics and physics in a skewed mind, because when you develop, it is because we have seen that there's a particular model that needs to be developed. But maths is there. Is a question of how do we train maybe educators to make maths an exciting subject so that we have a high enrollment rate of learners who have the pleasure and the passion to take maths and science or to take science subjects than to fall into other streams. The other point, it's the findings of the first article was that the persistence and in some ways the intensifications of serious structural challenges associated with unemployment. I could not draw the link there to say, now what does the structural challenges associated with unemployment, poverty, inequality in South Africa, so on and so forth, fits into the STEM pipeline project. The other point that I've taken note of, it says in the second paper, continues with ground theory as a method and examines how programs gradually and so forth. But I have no knowledge of what happens in the first paper. It's only the writer who knows what happened in the first. Now, if in the second paper it continues, I don't know where the first paper has left, so that to say, this is where the last paper left, and now this is where the second paper is continuing from. And grounded theory, I stand to be corrected. It is more applicable to qualitative research method than the quantitative. In my view, again, the paper, it's more of a quantitative. It's more quantitative in approach. And the reason why I'm saying that it is because it gives statistics. It says the STEM project was initially aimed at grade 12 learners who achieved a minimum of 65%. Now you need to quantify the 65% of how many learners who wrote mathematics in that particular year. And where do you get your data from? Maybe indicate in terms of the bar graph, the charts and so on and so forth to say, this is the proportion of, say, for example, 2021 cohort, 2020 cohort, and that's how we have arrived at the 65. But it goes on, of course, to say the project reported that it became evident that 2,800 learners taking physical science as a subject, only 2,200 do not obtain 50%. It's more, it's quantitative than to be qualitative. I think I'll wrap my comment on that, yes.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. I was going to have to stop you there because of time, but okay, thank you. Mvuzo, would you like to respond quickly?
Mic on, yes. No, I take Joseph's critiques, and I will have to go back to the drawing board, and I think that's the value of this engagement. The paper is very much draft format. I decided to actually go ahead and try to formulate something on the second paper instead of presenting on the first article, which is 80% done at this stage. So the reason why it doesn't have a title, and there are some inconsistencies when it comes to acronyms and such, is because it's very much in draft format. This last point about the grounded theory and it working well with, it actually works well. There's a lot of writing around suiting quantitative work as well. But I think, Joseph, this is very much a qualitative study, and there is use of numbers and such stats, and that is only because it's provided in the report. And I think the evidence, most of the evidence, and this is why I made the point that grounded theory was the most useful methodology for this work, because the report was handed to us, and so the report is there, and I might assume correctly or incorrectly that might be the case in a lot of the engagement work that is being conducted. There will be reports, and this might be incorrect because at times there won't be reports, and what to do in that case. But I think we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. So in this case, and happily so, and unfortunately, there was reports and which were written at length because they had to report to Sanral. Evidence of work had to be provided. So there's the most of the figures and information comes from that. And then we had to find a way in terms of how to interpret all of this. This is where grounded theory comes in, because it allows you to then formulate what's this hypothesis after you collected all the evidence, because the evidence is there. So I think I can wrap it up and say it's in development, and thank you very much, Joseph. Useful comment.
Excellent, thanks, Mvuzo. Are there questions for Mvuzo about his research?
Prof. Let me just throw myself in. My question is, the physics and the maths, the target group, is it the Kabeja as mentioned? I'm not sure if I'm misquoting, to say the project is around Kabeja. Will it benefit only the Kabeja learners, or maybe I'm looking at the bigger picture of knowledge economy in the sense that it will benefit the entire country, maybe to improve the economy of the country than to benefit a particular province? It's just a lighter question to ask, to say the primary beneficiaries are the Kabeja, the Eastern Cape province, or maybe it can be something that can benefit the entire provinces. Thank you.
Joseph, I think to start, I think I forgot to just cover this. I think you asked about the nature of the intervention, and I think it's basically tutorials. And so they provide tutorials to supplement the curriculum and what is being taught at schools, because a lot of times, especially in previously disadvantaged schools or currently disadvantaged schools, what is being taught, and even from a physical literature standpoint, the textbooks being provided are not sufficient. And then you also asked about socio-economic. In my note in the development of the paper around how does socio-economic issues of the country have to do with this particular intervention. And I think that had to do with the point on collaboration. Because of the issues the country faces, this is the importance of growing in industry to engagement, instead of limiting it to community development, which is about a university. I think a lot of times it's about a university going into disadvantaged community and then doing whatever you can. In this case, and this is something that was enlightening to me as well, this broad definition, it can bring in industry and is able to do much more in terms of that socio-economic development. And then I think at presently, to answer your last question, presently, the intervention I think is just based around Gadeja and immediate the region and immediate surround. I don't think it's been extended. There are links. The project is linked to UFS, for example, and I think that's the only link that I know with another kind of intervention outside of the Gadeja area.
Mvuzo, thank you. I think we're also now, I've got my eye on time again. I'm very interested in the connection between grounded theory as a methodology and philosophy as hermeneutics, interpretation. I think there's nice links that you can make there, but conversation for another time. Okay, so thank you very much. Really interesting. I think what we should maybe do now is move on to Abigail and Vulindlela. So Abigail, over to you.
Hi. It seems like Alex has had a bird in his office, and I'm looking after my neighbor's dog, and the dog ran out now and nearly got hit by cars. We all have our antics whilst things are going on at the same time. But anyway, I am wanting to present a paper that I will be presenting at a conference called Multisensuality Through History and Across Media, International Scientific Conference. It was a conference that a friend of mine shared with me and thought that I would have interest in presenting at it. Because of my interest in affect and shame, and specifically looking through what performance as a mode of inquiry can offer us in better understanding affect and how shame traffics in the body. So the title of the paper that I'm looking at is called Disconnection, Multisensuality and Shame's Affect in the Work of Gabriel Goliath. Now, Gabriel Goliath is quite a well-known South African visual artist. Her career is definitely taking off. She has had so many exhibitions in the last 5 years. At the moment, she's actually exhibiting in Dallas at the Contemporary Art Museum there. She has a piece that's debuting in Tunisia at the moment. She's had work in Basel last year in Switzerland. So yeah, she's really pulling a lot of attention, but one of her main sort of focuses with her work is about mourning. And she uses often more of a sonic sound in her performances. But the piece that I'm looking at is a piece what sort of introduced me to the work of Gabriel Goliath, and it's called Stumbling Block. And it's actually a very simple, unobtrusive, doesn't really draw a lot of attention type of performance art piece. It's a performer's body that is wrapped in gray blankets, those quite iconic pep blankets, also in a South African landscape, quite iconic with prisoners and sort of bedding that is used on prison beds. And my first engagement with Goliath's work was at the opening of the ICA, which is the Institute for Creative Arts at UCT. I was a master's student at the time. I was in my first year. And at the opening to the ICA Institute was Gabriel Goliath's piece called Stumbling Block. And as we entered the ICA, we had to navigate or traverse this body that was in the door frame and was acting as a stumbling block, as a blockage, as an impediment, something that we had to take action and respond to. And what Gabriel Goliath says specifically about this performance art piece is that it is a piece that requires response from people who interact with it. And it was a very catalyzing moment for myself as an artist when I engaged with Stumbling Block. In my paper, I talk about how touch is actually really powerful in that multisensuality dimension, but also the lack thereof. For my engagement with Stumbling Block, I didn't actually touch the body. I kind of navigated and walked around it to get into the venue. So just a bit of a framing about the specific performance art piece that I talk with in this piece, whilst I introduce you to some of the ideas, just to sort of assist you as I explain some of the parts and components of the paper. So the paper starts with, this paper opens a consideration around what the embodied and immersive and live exchange of performance aesthetics might make us feel, and in turn, how this multi-sensual engagement awakens the feeling body, specifically around notions of shame. In 1843, Karl Marx stated in a letter to a friend that shame is a revolutionary sentiment or feeling. Shame is revolutionary in its nature because it is both a state of disconnection and connection. In feeling shame, we highlight our human desire for connection, making it a fertile ground for empathy and change. In States of Shame, Caitlin Chara states, shame is both a site of exposure, but also a site of change. Shame separates us from others, causing us to experience that state of painful disidentification and self-consciousness. As outlined by Charos, the affective atmosphere present in South Africa today chants an urgent call to work towards lasting connections of empathy and understanding. In this paper, I argue working with shame through multi-sensual modalities gives us a way to look back, to look forward, in order to look in and to look out. I argue that one of the principles that Marcel Proust speaks of in Search of Lost Time, he says, the truths which intelligence grasps directly in the open light of day have something less profound, less necessary about them than those which life has communicated to us in spite of ourselves, in an impression, a material impression, because it has reached us through our senses. And more important than thought, there is what leads us to thought, impressions which force us to look, encounters which force us to interpret, expressions which force us to think. And my sort of argument that I make with the specific performance art piece by Goliath is that there's something so remarkable about multisensuality modalities in those moments of impression, and how they might trigger certain thoughts and experiences. And often sensual modes of knowledge production or meaning making are often sidelined, not given as much prominence or stage space in our critical discussions and awareness of what might be processing, what we might be processing and making sense of. And I sort of centralize quite a simple and doesn't really draw much attention to itself stumbling block, but I really speak to how profound that moment was in conceptualizing a lot of my thinking as a researcher, as a theatre maker, and as someone engaged with thinking around what affect can afford us in creating stronger connections with fellow humans.
Are you done?
How much time were we given, Andrea? Because I was a bit
to be completely honest, I don't know. I don't know what it was. Harshila who
because
said
I just heard from the beginning, Joseph said we had 5 minutes, but I thought it was originally 10 minutes. So
I also thought it was 10, but to be absolutely honest, I really actually don't know for sure.
Okay.
So if you would like to say, I mean, I'm happy to give you 10 minutes if you prefer to have that.
Okay, I think I'll just read a little section from the paper, and you guys can also then hear a little bit more of the development of my argument. And then I'll just take 5 minutes from now then, so I know exactly where I'm at on okay. Time. Do I step over or around? Should I not enter or address the person beneath the blanket? Or do I ignore the person completely and continue entering the room? Is there even a human body underneath it? Or is it just bundles of newspaper? I cannot remember if I chose to step over or around. However, in that transitory moment, one that I refuse to acknowledge and see in the quickness of moving through the doorframe, I assumed I had entered unscathed. Only when I sat on the other side and started to process what the moment had done to me, did I start to see how this action of numbing and pushing aside at internal tension had occurred in me on many other occasions, not so distinctly curated. In Goliath's artist statement, she states, this is a piece that demands response. The work requires a response involving physical action. You have to make a choice about how you're going to interact with the work, even if unconsciously. In their physical interaction with the work, the attendees publicly perform an internal response. Do you see the body as human or object? And if you see it as a human, how do you respond? Yet in this instance, it is not justified to see the body as an aestheticized art object. Or does the discomfort emanate from the body's being both subject and object, human and inanimate? Had I seen the work as art object, my reaction to the work would have been more calculated, distanced, and observational. I would have been able to rationalize my response by convincing myself that this was merely a piece of art. Stumbling block is a durational performance. The performance length is determined by the duration of the event where the piece is staged. As long as the event takes place, so too does the body lie in stillness. My interaction with the piece was one of the quickest engagements I've had with the performance. Yet the emotional negotiation and negation engendered by that brief moment were profound. Applied theatre practitioner and theorist James Thompson attests to the power of affect in unsettling audiences and provoking them to engage, ponder, and reconsider. He argues that after the event has passed, it is indeed through mediums of expression that agitate at a level of sensation that propels an inward demand to know more. It is thus the feeling which affect produces that sustains and drives the ongoing thinking about the encounter. Perhaps such affective moments are more efficient vehicles for sustained engagement of thought than theories. Is it perhaps also the case that these affective moments resonate with what feels right, true, and authentic, forcing us to reflect? Is it perhaps precisely because of how performances aesthetics affect us that the complexities of shame are laid bare in a way that theory cannot offer? Stumbling block facilitates a questioning of how certain codes of reading or performance conventions, in terms of which we see a body as not real but as an object, are also used in everyday life as a way of stopping oneself from feeling or processing what is felt. The attendees at the opening of the ICA interacted with the body in the performance piece as not a real indigent body. They stepped around and over the body while adhering to the rules of white cube spaces, where attendees do not interact with, touch, or speak to the artworks. However, it is precisely this action of stepping over and around in silence and in action towards another body that I had performed with real bodies in my day-to-day life. This passing around and over had occurred on the road just a few feet from the building where the piece was staged, a street where I had often passed by homeless people, quickly and in silence, attempting to be unnoticed. The encounter with Stumbling Block began an agitation within me, leading to a new way of seeing and a conviction that I would not be able to unsee. The work communicated to me outside of words and theories. I sat and pondered how on many other occasions I had responded similarly, and why so? Where the self-perpetuating habit in respect of which bodies I acknowledged and which ones I ignored developed. My personal action created a dissonance. I had thought that this fleeting and discrete action, occurring in a stream of moving bodies entering and exiting the threshold, would make my interaction with the piece ephemeral, quick, and indistinguishable from the responses implied by the hurried movement of other bodies. I had thought that this supposition about my interaction with the piece would make my action easier to forget, to erase, and perhaps deny, and in this way, remove a feeling of culpability.
Thanks, Abigail. That was, I'm very glad you continued. Vulindlela.
Hi, thank you, Abigail. I really like what you've been writing, and I think that there's something so potent about what you're talking about here, and I love Gabriel Goliath's work. You asked me at some point whether the abstract needed to be chopped down, and I think it does. What you gave right now was a brilliant abstract, and then jumping to the proofs. So chopping that last part out would be quite useful. Sorry for anyone who hasn't read everything. I'll send you what my notes look like. This from the beginning, I'm already, you know, when Andrea said hermeneutics would be a very interesting sort of approach to like inject into this as well, and reflexivity specifically. I'm reminded of actually another one of our colleagues, Rachel Collett, who in her master's thesis wrote about the insights of post-structuralist theory, where she suggested that whereas modernism's reflexive drive was directed towards truth and self-knowledge, and postmodern reflexivity is centrally concerned with the elusive, continually shifting nature of meaning. What emerges in the light of the practice of the individual artists and the authors, however, is that the modern and postmodern reflexive modes are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but can coexist, producing a vital and necessary tension. I think that's a conversation that's kind of, I feel, is sort of missing here. It's the sort of about turning and sort of kind of constantly having a conversation with oneself, a double consciousness, I suppose, that would be quite nice to sort of include in this work. Let me have a quick look at my other notes here. I like the idea of the encountering sign, and encountering a sign rather than reading a sign, and it's brought my mind to think about when one encounters something in a multi-sensory mode, how is that different to one encountering something? For instance, one of my favorite paintings is John Singer Sargent's Portrait of Thomas, and I saw it in Boston, and I burst out into tears the first time I saw it. So I kind of I wanted to sort of entangle myself in that sort of conversation as well, and to sort of heighten the sensory, the role of the sensory in your paper. And I love your analogy of stickiness. Something you didn't read that part out here, but you talk about stickiness. And I'll just, maybe if I can just quickly just read it for people here. Stickiness, therefore, by definition, interrupts individuality. It describes the state of converging with something outside of yourself. And when I read that, the only image I had in my head was the sort of bottlenecking that happens when people watch a car accident or drive past a car accident. And I think that there's that sort of morbid sense of like recognition of my mortality, the shame of being alive, and all the rest of it. And I'm not there, I'm here, I'm safe, but it's still coming for me, sort of thing. So I really kind of like that sense of that experience that sticks with you, and reminding of oneself of culpability, as you mention it. The other thing I really wanted to talk about was kind of and you mentioned it as in your reading, the sort of shame by association, and the sort of social recall in our minds and the sort of zeitgeist of people. You mentioned the evocation of poverty in the piece, and I ask, is the shame linked to the assumption of a person of color beneath the blanket as a kind of not a natural, but a common trigger of homelessness or association of homelessness? Is it a class-based shame? Is it about wealth? Is it about Goliath's intention to shame us? Or is he asking us to shame ourselves? I think really those are the conversations I was having in my head when I read your paper. I would love to see the end of it. I don't know about cutting it down too much. I think you can deliver this in 15 to 20 minutes. I also had, I don't know if you want to draw parallels to moments of tension, particularly in the liminal spaces that you mentioned. I was reminded of Abramovich's obviously very famous piece, the passage piece where two naked bodies, herself and her partner, standing within the doorframe of a gallery space, and people had to negotiate moving through there without, and people would obviously make contact with the physical and the touch of another person's naked body and all their vulnerabilities. So I'm wondering if is it too simple to bring that example in as a sort of touch point as well, or a place of comparison. And to finish, I'm interested in an idea of shamelessness by comparison. Where does shamelessness sort of sit with this? I don't know if I'm making sense for asking that question, but if shame exists in some form, what about, would there be an instance of shamelessness, you know? And I don't know if that would create more of a discourse around the piece itself. Those people rushing over, do they have a shamelessness? I mean, you talk about reducing the body to an object and not an indigent person, but that's kind of what I had to read into your work. Exciting stuff.
Wonderful, Vulindlela. Thank you. Awesome comments. Abby, would you like to respond briefly?
Yes, I was typing away the whole time you were talking and making notes of all of your great suggestions. I think that's also sometimes what's so hard about presenting a paper to an audience who's not familiar with you or with your thinking or your ideas, is that there's often a whole lot of other ideas that you can also attach to it. And I sometimes find it's just so hard to narrow down how many connections do you make, how many comparisons do you make or don't make. I do think that Abramovich must be included because I think it's a bit of it can take the piece to more of an international audience. It's a comparative of what Goliath is trying to do with Stumbling Block. So I think I'll definitely add that. To touch off from the end of your discussion about shamelessness, I've been thinking a lot about that, and it's quite interesting when I do sort of present papers about shame. A lot of people will immediately want to ask, is that me having a bad reverb?
No, I think it's just maybe my microphone's on.
Okay, maybe I think it might be better if you are muted. It's quite interesting that a lot of people will immediately ask, well, what is shamelessness? And I've been thinking about that for a long time, about how do people also not experience shame. And I think one of the sort of framings or theoretical constructs around what shame is shame is a reflection of the self, and it's a heightened awareness. So it's to reflect, to be reflexive of the self, and it's a heightened awareness of self. And I would probably pose that people who are shameless actually don't have an awareness of self, that there is a consciousness that is actually lacking, or just a societal awareness of self within relation to others. And I do think that there perhaps would be a different framing where there are some children who aren't shamed. And I think there's a lot of parenting that's happening now that's trying to reshape humans that have been historically shamed into obedience, shamed into silence, shamed into being controlled. And there's this heightened awareness around how we use a shaming language, how we use shaming actions of coercion. So I would say that there are some people who have less shame than others, and experience more heightened states of shame than others. But shamelessness would be something I would be less inclined to adopt. I would wager that I would say that the person hasn't gone there yet. They haven't been willing to engage with themselves. And there's a resistance to even go there into the depths of self. Also, those ideas that you quickly touched on about shame, and is it shame about class? Is it shame triggered in a specific race that's associated with homelessness? Is it Goliath's intention to shame? What is the perhaps framing of shame within this performance piece? And I think that what makes the piece so interesting is that it evokes different reactions in different people. And in a way that sort of mirrors shame, that for me, there was something within that moment and that time. And I also contextualized my engagement with that specific performance piece at the time, because I was perhaps my self-awareness was heightened to certain parts of myself at that time. And that was perhaps what triggered elements of shaming reactions around the piece. But for someone who might not have a classist shame, they might not engage with the piece in the same way. And I think that's also what I find interesting with more multi-sensual modalities that are, or encounters of that are essential, actually get us to kind of engage with those core elements of shame in relation to the self, because we're not attaching a language or an articulation at first to it, but we're actually engaging with what is that sensation, that trigger doing and evoking in me. And I think that's what opens up the plurality of shame, that there's so many branches and dimensions of it, and that it should never be something that's silenced. And it should never be something that we say, do you have shame? Or what shame do you have? I've got no shame. You know, how can you have shame? But it's about understanding the sort of the universalism of humanity's experience of shame. And that in that sort of core expression or experience of shame is that we seek out fellow connection with other humans because of interest in other humans. And in that, the kind of countering of shame is that experience of heightened disconnection.
Abigail Vulindlela, it's a fabulous, really interesting conversation, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop it. You know, in the interest of giving everyone sort of equal time, but it is definitely I'm a party crasher. Sorry, I apologize for that. But it's definitely a conversation we need to carry on, and yes, hopefully at our in-person symposium, when Abigail will be doing a performance herself, maybe we can arrange a kind of a longer session around that. But I know I said this in our last symposium, but then we've had a period of inactivity on my part, but I will reactivate myself hopefully soon, and then we will perhaps begin a seminar session where we have one person at a time, and then we have a proper long conversation that will you know, not crash the party. But in the meantime, we really actually do have to move on. Marty, welcome, glad to see you here. Hope that home affairs wasn't too traumatic for you. So perhaps we should then, because Alex and Marty are here now, so maybe we should begin with you. Are you ready to chat with us? Okay, awesome. So, but maybe let's give you a bit of a breather and get Alex up.
Sure, I can kick things off, and let's see if my signal cooperates with the ability to have video here. Sorry, I just realized I have helmet hair from riding on my motorbike, so I apologize. Anyway, let's dive into the piece of work for today. So what I thought I'd present today is sort of a work in progress, which is the beginnings of a book proposal that I'm working on. And the title, or the proposed title of the book project, is Overthrowing Eco-Apartheid. And I'm calling it Overthrowing Eco-Apartheid because eco is both the root for ecology and economy. So it comes from the Greek word, I think I'll see if I say this right, oikos, which means house or household. So, you know, the economy and ecology are arguably both very important elements of our shared home and can't be separated. So I'm almost imagining a book cover that has overthrowing eco, and then out of eco having nomic and logic coming out of it like a serpent's tongue or something like that, as a way of, you know, having that imagery to show that our economic and ecological crises are pretty deeply intertwined, and so they have a shared root cause. And so jointly, through a pretty rapacious economic system, we're increasingly being where the benefits are increasing in the hands of the few, whereas the increasingly devastating ecological harms of that system are being felt most harshly by the global majority, particularly the poor, particularly people of color, Black communities, Indigenous communities. If you analyze a lot of the the studies around where those impacts fall the hardest, right? And this is all pretty high level because this is a book proposal that's a work in progress. So excuse me if it's a little bit vague, but the book is aiming to also explore, sort of focus in on the South African context to think a bit about how what we did in South Africa was overthrowing the sort of formal political apartheid, but for the large part, we didn't overthrow the intertwined economic and ecological structures of apartheid. And those continued structures have combined to make South Africa at the moment both the most unequal country on earth and also one of the most polluting. So if you look at a measure of South Africa's carbon emissions per unit of GDP, we're among the worst polluting countries on earth, right? I think in the top 3 potentially, behind just a few pretty egregious polluters. And so part of the book's underlying sort of activist thesis, because I often write from a scholar activist perspective, is that sort of the current generation's generational mission, to borrow a term from Frans Fanon, is to sort of overthrow this eco-apartheid, building on previous generations' missions of overthrowing formal political apartheid. And sort of recognizing that, you know, you can't overthrow the economic without the ecological side of things because they're intertwined. So if, for example, the EFF tells us we want economic freedom in our lifetimes, you can't really do that without also having ecological freedom, because if you don't do the one without the other, then they will erode each other. And I think one of the pitfalls that I'm wanting to avoid is something like Sizwe Mpofu-Moltsche's book, where he kind of talked about the new apartheid, and it was all kind of very unclear, and it wasn't clear in defining what that looked like, and it kind of was a bit all over the place. It's a very popular book, but it didn't really have a very clear thesis around, you know, what the new apartheid is. And in some ways, the new apartheid is very much an old apartheid. And I think that's part of what this book is trying to explore, is that actually a lot of this goes back to the sort of foundations of colonialism when we think about the structures that exist. And so it's not really new. So South Africa will be a central focus, but I'm also trying to show that South Africa is in some ways not an aberration, but is kind of a microcosm of global reality, and that South Africa's sort of struggle with the sort of eco-apartheid is a shared feature for many anti-colonial struggles, and sort of drawing here on Kwame Nkrumah, this idea of neo-colonialism, that shows that, you know, what we've got now is a form of neo-colonialism where, you know, it's no longer ruled directly by, you know, British colonies, but that there is levers of economic leverage that still drives a lot of the extraction to multinational corporations. And I think this also draws on the likes of Walter Rodney, who's a Guyanese historian, academic, and political activist, who talked about how under colonialism, the ownership was complete and backed by military domination. But today in many African countries, the foreign ownership is still present, although the armies and flags of foreign powers have been removed. And so the new flags flying are those of multinational corporations, often headquartered in overseas jurisdictions, but also in terms of new sort of corporate formations locally that are driving that extraction. So I think what the book's trying to add to such critiques of neocolonialism is the sort of more underappreciated ecological elements of it. And what I'm trying to argue is that the intertwined nature of ecological and economic apartheid does go back to the roots of colonialism. And here I'd like to draw on the work of a South African philosopher and historian, Danford Chibongotse. And he details how creating a separation between people and nature was central to the colonial and capitalist project, because by separating people from nature and from their communities, they were better able to exploit them and to drive them into wage labor. And here Chibongotse reflects on how if you analyze early visions or versions of Ubuntu or Ukama in other places, that relatedness was not just community of people, but community to ecology too, and how a central part of the colonizer's role was to break down both of those communities and relationships in order to gain access to people's lands. And so that's kind of the central founding sin of, I guess, the eco-apartheid in a way. But then to maybe both recognize that the forms of eco-apartheid are not necessarily new and are grounded in colonialism. Some of its manifestations are, And so here the notion of eco-apartheid builds on the idea of what's being called climate apartheid. This is where the rich pay to escape the heat and hunger caused by the escalating climate crisis, while the rest of the world suffers the brunt of its impacts. And here there's been quite a bit of literature that has been coming out recently about climate apartheid. So for example, Philip Alston, who was the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, said if we do not act on climate change, its impacts are likely to undermine the basic rights to life, water, food, and housing for hundreds of millions of people. And he was talking about, warning there about the possibilities of climate apartheid and the need to take drastic action to avoid that. And I think one of the elements, which is, I think reading Marty's paper was thinking about how race is central to a question of apartheid or a definition of apartheid. And when we think about the way that these impacts play out, echoing sort of other forms of apartheid before it, climate and eco-apartheid is permeated with questions of racial justice, because if you do an analysis, typically the wealthier, whiter communities and countries that have contributed the most to the problem and also benefit the most from the systems driving it. Meanwhile, it's poorer, brown and black communities and countries that are most impacted and have least benefited. So yeah, that's kind of where the book is going. And I think I've got a list of chapters that I'm thinking of developing to help flesh out different elements of that. But I thought I would just present this very broad work in progress. And I'm also going to be presenting a talk on overthrowing eco-apartheid next month at the Forge in Johannesburg. So I'm trying to develop this into a more publicly accessible talk soon. So yeah, thank you.
There we go. Sorry, muted. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, really interesting. And I think just directly over to Marty to the comment. Marty, you are muted.
Not muted, but your mic isn't working. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh dear. Can you hear us? Yeah.
I think sorry if I may suggest this, if the microphone is plugged in, you might have to tell your computer to use in settings the microphone that is attached to your.
Can you hear me now?
That's better.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, no, it was just not plugged in properly. That's all. I'm sorry. It's all in the rush to log on. I'm so sorry. Okay, so I started by saying I loved reading this exciting book proposal. I can, you know, I think your analysis obviously will be fleshed out in the book, but the key idea is spot on. In fact, I don't know if you, and then I love the title. I really love the title because you sent me, maybe the others haven't seen it, but you know, the way that you want to graphically display it, and I think that's very effective. So you'll need a good graphic designer. Someone like Alan Boesak, I don't know if you know his work, he developed the concept of global apartheid. And he wrote a lot. I think his latest book will be on global apartheid. I don't know if it has been published, but maybe you can Google it. So he has a very, very strong focus on the economic side to things. So that is the one angle that I think is you know, he also argues that how we understand apartheid can have different contexts. I do think that it might be very important for you to look at the definitions. There are 3 in international law on apartheid, and in these definitions, I know from my field, the thorny issue, or the issue that people often take you on, is is the matter of race. So then maybe, but there are people have written about it, and if you can qualify race also as a social political grasp, because some of these definitions talk about a group, one group dominating another. So race is not necessarily skin color. It's not necessarily a phenotypical description. It could be other things as well, but maybe, you know, you need to spend some time on that in your book. And then the other aspect that I find fascinating, and I think this is something unique that we can offer from the South African perspective, is, and the African perspective, are the terms Ubuntu and the other one that you mentioned, and what that means to economic policy. Now, obviously, these terms and the communal structure of societies in Africa have been disturbed by centuries of Western influence. But what can we still learn from it? I mean, no one in the world has all the answers, but the dualist, the separation approach of the West have killed so many things. And yet most Western people, and increasingly some other people, maybe not increasingly, but many other people, aspire to the Western model. And we need to be, I think, unpack and be honest about what the Western model cannot offer us, and what can we learn from maybe monistic models, especially when we look at the ecological situation. Yeah, so I think that your theme and your book is a platform to address the kinds of questions that my generation hope your generation will solve. Thank you.
Thanks, Marty. Yes, wouldn't that be, yeah, I don't know if that's a bit of I don't know, a cop-out to ask the younger generation to sort out the, but yeah, Alex, would you like to respond briefly?
Yeah, thanks very much, Marty. Those are really helpful thoughts. And I think the idea of Alan Busak's global apartheid, and particularly the economic side of things, is pretty important. Particularly, I mean, if you look at measures of inequality, like the Gini coefficients, you know, South Africa being the most unequal country in the world, at the global level, it's even higher, right? And so I think that does speak to a global economic apartheid that exists and that isn't as clearly recognized. So I think I'll definitely look into Alan Busak's work. I'm not familiar with it, but I think that'll be really helpful. And the question of race is actually a question I was going to have for your paper, so maybe I'll save that. We can discuss it more when it comes to yours, race and apartheid, because I'd love to hear your thinking on how that plays out in your context, because I do think it is going to be one of the trickier elements in my thinking on this. Particularly as, for example, we get, let's say, Black economic empowerment in the coal industry, which begins to shift some of the racial dynamics in the South African sort of minerals energy complex, and starts to complicate like more clear claims about who benefits and who doesn't when it comes to these structures. And then the question about philosophies, alternative philosophies, and what they mean for our economic policy, I think is really important. And I think here in the climate context, one person who's thought a lot about this is an indigenous American philosopher, Carl Powers White, who talked about, if we think about what it means to ensure reparations for climate change and to rebuild, that we need to rebuild our sense of community, our sense of trust, our institutions. And so it's a very different sense of you know, what it means to recover and do reparations, both from climate change, but also from, you know, broader forms of oppression that require reparations. And so it is grounded in those alternative philosophies. So along with the African philosophies, I think there's also a lot of other important indigenous approaches and alternative ways of thinking that could help inform that. So thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Alex. We have a minute or two. If you would like, if anybody would like to ask questions, perhaps Janet. I don't know if I'm kind of putting you in the spot or under the spot there, but I mean, Janet is the host for Alex's presentation. Hi, Janet.
Hi. Yeah, no, I'd love to just come in and say thanks. I found this whole discussion quite stimulating, but I was listening to Mabisi Jonas giving the Govan Mbeki Memorial Lecture the night before last, and you know, for all his criticism of the South African society and government and so on, and him saying we need economic restructuring, actually what he's saying is that growth is absolutely unconditional. We actually have to have economic growth. Now, I'm thinking about what Alex said about new local formations driving extraction and the role of, you know, the coal industry, etc. This is not a neo-colonial formation or a racial formation. It's a class formation. And anyway, I'm really interested in this debate. I'm happy to take it further. Thanks.
Thanks, Janet. Alex, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, sure thing. I mean, I think the questioning of economic growth is really important. And, you know, I think in South Africa, when you get economic growth, it benefits a very few, just because of the structures of that typically filtering up to the top. And so I think we really do need to question the directions of economic growth, the forms and the types that we want to encourage. And I think a key element of that is redistribution of wealth and redistribution of resources to stimulate the areas of the economy that we think are more beneficial, rather than just stoking the minerals energy complex, which tends to, you know, concentrate hands in the few. And then the question of whether it's neo-colonial, I guess, is a tricky one. I think there are forms of neo-colonial extraction that come with, like, say, Montashe's partnership with Shell on the Eastern Cape Coast. And there are elements of it which are just, you know, more naked class interests locally, where we do have, you know, local elites that are benefiting from it, sometimes in partnership with, you know, in multinational corporations, but sometimes just with domestic corporations. So I think that does complicate the story in terms of how much of it might be classified neatly as neo-colonial and how much of it is just corporate structures that benefit off the legacies of colonial extraction that still exist in South Africa. And that maybe is still a form of neo-colonialism, even if it's not driving from multinational corporates or a foreign interest, if that makes sense. No. But that's a discussion that could take a good long while.
Yeah, it could take us a few days. I look forward to it.
Thanks, Janet. Again, another reason to do a proper seminar series where we have our postdocs sitting in the hot seat, just you know, all by themselves, and we have a proper session on that. So I will. I know I promised it last time, but we will keep it in mind and get it going. Okay, but in the interests of time, I think we need to move on. Marty, would you like to do your presentation?
Thank you, Andrea. And
Okay.
thanks, Alex and Janet. Also, yeah, I think sometimes my work and topic sounds to people outside of my field to something very foreign. So I hope I'm just going to explain the basic idea of what I want to do in an article that I will publish specifically in Afrikaans because I think it's relevant, but I will also talk to it in English next Tuesday at a conference here at the faculty at Stellenbosch University's Faculty of Theology. The conference is on Reformed theology, which is a specific strand of theology in Christianity. And my topic is Okay, and the theme of this conference is Mirrors and Windows, reflecting on Reformed tradition today. And my topic is apartheid. Apartheid then and now, where are we heading? And the subtitle is Reformed Church Responses to the Case of Israel-Palestine. So, well, the issue of theological and ecclesial or church responses to apartheid is particularly relevant to South African churches. I mean, you may want to ask me why this topic and why this topic in theology, but this issue is very particularly relevant to South African churches in light of our own church struggle during apartheid. Now, I wasn't part of that struggle, but I learned about it afterwards. During South African struggle, some churches, as I do know, and I think as everyone knows, actively defended apartheid, and others opposed it. And both the oppressed and the oppressor claimed loyalty to God. And when the Truth and Reconciliation hearing was commissioned hearings, during those hearings, most churches, to a lesser or a greater extent, actually the findings were that most of them were complicit in supporting or maintaining the apartheid regime in some or other way, even if it was through silence. But also in all these denominations, there were people who openly opposed the discriminative regime. So there were these divergent theologies in the crisis of apartheid in our country. And in 1985, a group of theologians, mainly Black theologians, but not exclusively Black, gathered in Soweto, and they analyzed the kinds of different social, political agendas that influenced the operant theologies of churches and of Christians at the time. And they identified three types: those who are, you know, almost believe in a militarist God. So that's very much a focus on the a marriage between the state and the church, and might and violence, and all of it justified in order to protect the state. We saw that kind of theology also in Nazi Germany, for example. But I mean, that was the one kind of theology that they identified. The other was church, what they called church theology, and that is the kind of theology where God sits on the fence. So it's the God of double standards. One set of standards is applied to this group of people, and the other set of and another set of standards are applied to other people. And so cautious language are used, and religious leaders and people of faith play things both sides, but to advance their own agendas. And then there's prophetic theology, which says no, but there is justice and injustice, and all have been created in the image of God, and it doesn't matter what your religion or your skin color or your orientation or whatever it is, we're all equal in the eyes of God. So, but the thing is, in the years that I've been involved in the matter of Palestine and Israel, I became aware that these same dynamics, these different theologies, are actually also present not only in South Africa, or this is the impression that I got, but not only in South Africa, but globally, internationally. And so very recently, in fact, I became aware of it broadly, and very recently, the public debate on Israel's relationship to the Palestinians started to be dominated by the word apartheid. The question is Israel guilty of apartheid or not? But it doesn't apply only to the public debate. A month ago, the World Council of Churches 11th Assembly convened in Karlsruhe in Germany. And there were heated heated debate. I mean, Alex may have seen some of my notes. I cannot include all of it in the article, but it turned very ugly and very heated. The issue of whether Israel is guilty or practices apartheid. So since 1948, when the State of Israel was announced, the Christian faith has been, this is well documented, been used to provide a theological basis for the establishment of Israel as a Jewish-only state on the territory of historic Palestine. And the support for Israel's ongoing dispossession and oppression since and after 1948 has always relied on the maintenance of several myths, such as the Palestinians were never a nation or a people. God promised the land to the Jewish people. God blesses those who bless Israel. The world owes the Jews the national haven to compensate for millennia of persecution. And criticizing Israel is anti-Semitic. And I just want to say here that I believed most of those things until about 15 years ago. So for this postdoc, in the absence of an index on if and how and to which extent South African churches position themselves in relation to justice for Palestinians, I initiated a project to chronicle the official statements, recommendations, and resolutions of churches, ecumenical organizations, and other members of the South African Council of Churches. Now, in this paper, I provide an overview of the theological and ecclesial responses to Israeli apartheid, with a special focus on South African churches in the Reformed tradition. And the scope of time that I cover is, it starts in 2007. That was when the first resolution by the World Council of Churches was accepted. And it continues to September 2022 with the 11th Assembly of the World Council of Churches. And when I look at South African church responses, I'm going to contextualize it in terms of reports and resolutions and statements by other global Christian bodies and national bodies, such as the South African Council of Churches, the World Communion of Reformed Churches, which represents about 90 to 100 million people in the world, and then the World Council of Churches. I will also look at the statements of the Palestinian Christians, and then obviously I will look at which of the South African Reformed churches have statements and resolutions, and what do they entail. But in order to analyze whether they speak of apartheid, when did they start to speak of apartheid, whether they silence, whether they have, or whether they actively oppose, considering whether Israel oppresses the Palestinians. For all of that, I need to have the baseline of how the global community understands two terms, actually: occupation, which applies to Palestine, and then obviously apartheid. So I start the discussion with that. And then I discuss these various developments since, actually basically from Amman in 2007 to Karlsruhe in 2022. And then I conclude because the pattern is most alarming. I'll just conclude with this one thing. What is very interesting is that the first church that officially opposed apartheid by, let me just say that, by signing the Kairos document, the first Reformed church was also the first Reformed church to oppose Israel's oppression of the Palestinians. I'm talking about South African church. And the church during South African apartheid that actively promoted state and the problematic double standard church theology during apartheid is also now the church that does the same in respect of Israel. So this scenario does not play out only in South Africa, but this is a bit of an aside, but it comes through in the article that the evangelical evangelical church in Germany that supported National Socialism also now refuse to even look at human rights, 3 very, very strong human rights reports that were issued in the last 2 years. They refuse to do so. So they don't even want to engage with the topic. So, and they are one of the most powerful and richest Reformed churches in the world. And obviously then I will have to evaluate and ask questions and ask, you know, is apartheid wrong only in some contexts and not in others? And because those 3 reports that include B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization, and it's an awarded human rights organization, B'Tselem. The other organization is Amnesty International, and the third one is Human Rights Watch. So these are 3 reputable human rights organizations that within the scope of a little bit more than a year issued in-depth, detailed reports, not as opinions, but doing the painstaking legal work of a legal analysis of, okay, these are the definitions of apartheid, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this is how Israel meets those definitions. Yeah, so the conclusion will be about how serious are churches, about the fact that all human beings are created in the image of God, and what theological arguments can be used to dismiss Israel apartheid. Those are the questions that I will conclude with. But the issue here is that the church has become, and also the church in South Africa. Aside of struggle, I'm done.
Okay, sorry, we're running quite far over time.
Sorry.
All right, but I mean, it's fascinating, but time. So maybe just directly over to Alex for a comment.
Thanks very much, Marty. I enjoyed reading your paper, and I think there's lots of interesting stuff there. One thing I thought, particularly when you're trying to make comparisons between churches and the statements that they've made when it comes to, you know, South African apartheid and now when it comes to Israeli apartheid, I was wondering if it's possible to do sort of a comparative analysis where there's some churches that might have condemned South African apartheid, but then are not doing the same with Israel, and what the differences are, and whether there's maybe some hypocrisy that starts to sneak into their inability to condemn the one versus the other. And I know you start to look at which ones have and which ones haven't in some of your work, but I think maybe some of that comparative analysis could be interesting to see, you know, what the differences are there. I do think it's interesting that you're pointing also to the evangelical church and the role that they have played in continuously supporting apartheid. And I think now, if you look at the US evangelical church in particular, and the role that they have in propping up some of the worst of the sort of white supremacist Republican Party, that there is this definitely some continuity that goes there in terms of the evangelical church often being a wing of white supremacy. And I think even if dating back to the South African apartheid history with the Republican Party and the Evangelical Party actually supporting South African apartheid, I think that kind of runs through, particularly with the US and the Republican Party being very much staunchly in favor of supporting Israeli apartheid too. And then I think one of the other elements, and this was one of the comments you made on mine, is this question of the racial definition of apartheid. And I think you hinted a bit to the answer where race could maybe be a bit broader than just, a strict racial identity. And I think there was a US ruling about Jewish people not strictly being a race, but can still be targets of racism. And I wonder if the same applies to thinking about Palestinian peoples, maybe not strictly being a race, but being an ethno-national grouping, such that is the definition of race in the apartheid definitions broad enough to accommodate that in terms of like a strict legal interpretation, or does one have to broaden that out, I guess is the question there. And maybe because we're tight on time, I'll leave my other question because it's quite a lengthy one involving quotes and so on. But maybe I can send that to you as well. Thanks, Marty.
Okay.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, interesting questions. Marty, would you like to just respond quickly, and then we can try and open it up?
Yes, thank you. The first question was about comparison of churches. Because I'm dealing now only with Reformed churches, there are basically only 3 Reformed churches in South Africa that have official responses. And 2 of them also opposed apartheid in South Africa. The one is the Uniting Reformed Church, where Alan Busak is, for instance, belongs to. The other one is the United Congregational Church of Southern Africa, and they were the first to officially oppose or to sign the South African CARUS document. And the other church that has a statement is the Dutch Reformed Church. So, and we know that they supported South African apartheid, and now they do not use the word apartheid, but they have they have a 31-page long document, a 31-page document that you will find on the internet. I think it's only in Afrikaans, which is very problematic theology, and really is what we call liberal Zionism. So those are the 3 churches. And in terms of your remark on, but I will highlight that in the conclusions and the rest are silent, which is also significant, and one also needs to comment on that. The evangelical church in Germany, yeah, they differ, I think, from the evangelical church in the US and South Africa. The more charismatic evangelical churches tend to read the Bible in a literal manner, and that's their stumbling block. That's what makes them think the way they want to, and they like power and they vote for Trump and so on also. But the German church, the Protestant church in Germany, their issue is that they learned that you cannot discriminate against Jews. But they haven't learned that you cannot discriminate against anyone. So they make this issue all about themselves because they still feel so guilty, and they should, about discriminating against Jews. But I think it's fine now if other people are killed and other children are maimed and young people lose their legs and arms just to protect Jews who attack them. So, but they are closed for discussion. They are just closed for discussion. I've seen that over and over. Okay, and then on the issue of race, yes, I acknowledge that I also have to offer a more nuanced explanation of how race applies in this context. So these reports that I referred to, they speak of some categories, and that you have seen in my paper. But I think the real issue here is that and some of them say this as well, all of them say this, that there are clearly 2 groups, clearly. The one is Palestinian, the other one is Jewish. Now, what does it mean to be Jewish? According to Israel's laws, only 2 things. You have to speak Hebrew, and you have to identify as a Jew. You don't have to be a Semite. You don't have to be religious. You don't have to live in Israel. You just have to identify as a Jew. So, and this is discrimination. There is an ethnic element to it, but sometimes there is not. But you see in Israel itself, because all these reports found that Israel practices apartheid not only in Palestine, but also in Israel, because in Israel, if you don't have, there's no such thing as Israeli citizenship. There's only Jewish citizenship. Only Jews get full civil rights. Arab Israelis and others live in Israel. They have citizenship, but not full citizenship because they don't have Jewish citizenship. So this is clearly a group discrimination, and I think that is the bottom line, but I think it needs to be said. Yeah.
Okay, thank you both. A very, very interesting conversation. Another one that could go on forever. We're kind of over your 20-minute mark. So unless there are burning questions, I think we should probably move on to our last presentation. Okay. Thank you both. It was really fascinating. And yeah, again, a reminder that we need to have single sessions for each of you. So I think though that Busisiwe unfortunately is having connection problems. So she won't be able to respond to Claudia, but Claudia will present, and then maybe we can just, as a group, respond to her. And that will be our final presentation then for this session. Okay, so Claudia, over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. I've turned my camera on in the hopes that my connection doesn't bomb out. Yeah, let's give it a try. So I'm actually reporting on the same article that I reported on last time, mainly because it was a bit of a Pandora's box. So I will just give a brief summary of what it was again, just as a reminder. Last time I reported on an article that I'm writing with Dr. Mark Runch on the African epic Ushaka Kasenzankona by Mzikala Kumalo. It's a work for orchestra and choir. And it was partly orchestrated by the composer Christopher Langford James, who was born in 1952 and died in 2008. James, despite his significant involvement in the project, has received little recognition for his efforts. Dr. Runch wrote his PhD on Christopher James, but he didn't go into the copyright issue surrounding this particular work in any kind of depth. So my part in this project will be to write that, whilst Dr. Runch will be writing a more sort of life writing perspective on the particular work and putting it my section of the article in context. So as I mentioned at the last symposium, there was a master's thesis written on this subject by Antoni Schunken in 2012 from Stellenbosch, who wrote a very convincing analysis on the musical contribution that James made to the work, and concludes that about 57%, nearly 58% of the fundamental musical material in Ushaka can be attributed to James. James's contribution to Ushaka is therefore already assumed. So the paper that we're writing in turn does not seek to establish whether James' work deserves acknowledgement in the final version of Ushaka. Rather, the work is used as a case study to demonstrate the manner in which the current copyright legislation, namely the Copyright Act of 1978, does not adequately address the musical authorship and ownership aspects under the current copyright law. So at the last symposium, I mentioned that we still needed to go to the Christopher James Archive, which is held at the Documentation Center for Music at Stellenbosch University. So since my last presentation, Dr. Rinsch and I have done that, and quite a number of documents have come to light. These included, for example, letters from the Southern African Music Rights Organization, personal correspondence around the Ushaka saga, royalty statements, concert programs, and it was really quite an eye-opener in many respects, because a lot of these royalty statements revealed that James was receiving very, very small amounts of money for his work in Ushaka. At times, a percentage of less than 5% for his contribution, amounts of money of less than 100 Rand for large-scale performances that took place in the 1990s. It's quite an extensive archive. It was put together and curated by James's mother, Marjorie, who died a number of years ago. And quite a considerable task to go through all of these documents in true mother style. I suppose she kept everything she could. So we're now in the writing phase that is and putting a lot of this information together and I'm trying to link it to current to the current Copyright Act in many respects. So yeah, this is pretty much where I am. What the other interesting thing that came up in this is that Christopher James appears to have signed a number of agreements where he agreed to the very small royalties that he was receiving. And it is not clear to me at this stage why he would have done that. I'm not sure, as I mentioned last time, whether it was because he was perhaps somebody who lacked full capacity. He, in a legal sense, he suffered from schizophrenia. And I'm not sure if perhaps he was in a bad patch at the time that he signed these documents, or if it was simply just a case of he wasn't aware of what his rights were, which is an interesting point, because I think it is demonstrative of the case of a lot of musicians and artists who are in a similar position in terms of signing documents, that they aren't really aware of what they're signing. So I have a meeting with Chris James's daughter, Melissa, this coming weekend, and that's a question that I would like to ask her. She's also the executor of his estate, and just to put to her the question of why she thinks her father signed these documents. So yeah, this is pretty much where we are at this point with the article.
Claudia, thanks. Okay, yeah. That was quick.
It was quick. I had it written out, and then I decided to skip a few bits because I felt I was repeating.
No, thanks.
time.
Yeah, as I said, Busisiwe unfortunately has had connectivity problems, so she won't be able to respond to you. But perhaps we could just open it up to one or two questions from, the rest of us. Yeah, Vulindlela,
Yeah.
maybe. If he's...
Hi, sorry, I don't really have a question.
Oh, sorry, I'm just I was just putting you in the hot seat just for.
But thanks for the presentation, Claudia.
No, thanks, Vulindlela.
Anyone else? We've sort of got to that exhausted end part, I think, of our present. So,
Prof.
Joseph, yes, thank you.
My question, it's how will the meeting with the daughter of the writer will change the narrative landscape as to why the royalty was so less? The reason why I'm asking that question is because publishers have a particular way of contracting writers as freelancers, and for some reasons they will put a particular rate to say if so much copies are sold, that will be the royalty that is to be paid to you. And if you are content with the rate that has been put before you, obviously you will give away your intellectual property rights to the publishers. I come from that space, but I'm just curious to know how will the meeting with the daughter change the narrative landscape of the article? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. That's a good question. I think for me, what will be important is because the distribution of royalties in this particular case was not proportional, shall we say, to the work or the contributions that were made in an artistic sense. I would be interested to know whether Christopher James signed these royalty agreements out of ignorance, for want of a better word, or for some other reason, perhaps one related to his mental state. I'm not sure, but I'm really interested to know that, because it seems to me very out of the ordinary that somebody would agree to the conditions that he agreed to. I don't know if that answers your question.
Not necessarily, but it's okay, because I was patiently to hear to say my interview with her, this is how it will change. Maybe it will give a new perspective. Maybe the daughter might have had a conversation with the father before the father passed away to say, the publication industry, it's like maybe the jungle, one's life in the jungle. You eat or you are eating. So, and for one reason or the other, my intellectual property, that's how it was eaten by the publishers and so forth. But I'm not looking for a specific answer, but I was just saying maybe something will come out to say, this is what my father said. These are the
I will definitely give that some thought. Yeah, thank you.
So
no, I think what we definitely know is that he wasn't happy about what he was receiving after the fact, because we have letters and emails to that effect. So we do know that. So the question is why he agreed to it in the first place.
Thanks, Georgia. Joseph, Claudia. I did say Georgia. It was a conflation of the two. So, would your article then help change copyright law in any way?
Oh, I wish it would, but I don't think it will have that effect. But I suppose what I'm hoping to get out of this article is to use Christopher James almost as a case study, to perhaps demonstrate in what ways the current copyright law isn't effective in particular cases. But I think, to get back to Joseph's question, that's also why the interview is important, because I don't want to make assumptions about the agreement before I've spoken to Melissa.
Okay, any more questions, discussion on, or shall we call it an afternoon?
Just a quick one, Prof.
Go for it.
Maybe I wanted to give others a chance to ask one. Now that you are closing the door, I'm saying let me walk through before the door is closed. My other interest is to find out how the article as well will assist authors or writers before signing up their contract, so that their knowledge is not consumed by the capitalists, who will be making money, and for some reasons the writers will be paid less royalties. Hence, I said I also come from that space. But I just want to find out whether the article will make a particular impact to writers, to us as authors or writers, to say these are the things that you need to take care of before you commit yourself by penning your signature on the contract agreement. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that argument will be there to make the suggestion that obviously to understand what you're signing before you sign it. But what I'm hoping to do is suggesting that these categories that we have for music, in this case, orchestration, was Christopher James's formal role, except he was actually really a composer, he was a creator, and these things are not really defined properly in our copyright law. They're only defined in terms of by the South African Music Rights Organization, and they decide according to themselves how the royalties should then be split up, but it's not done in a very artistically informed way. So my argument is then ready to say that we need to start thinking about these things in a way that tries to integrate the legal aspect and the artistic aspect, them in such a sort of disconnected sense, because that I think is where things might have gone very wrong for Christopher James as well.
Okay, Claudia, thanks. We're kind of losing you a little bit, sound and well, just sound-wise, I am anyway. I'm not sure if anybody else is, but I think Joseph's metaphor was actually an excellent one, that we will be closing this door, closing the door on this particular engagement, and there will be other doors that we will be opening periodically throughout the year, our workshop and our hopefully in-person symposium at the beginning of next year. So we'll be opening all sorts of doors, hopefully towards one another as well. I see there's been a lot going on in the chat, lots of exchange, which is very exciting and invigorating. So I want to thank you all very much for joining us, and sort of encourage you to keep engaging with one another. I think it's really useful to have feedback from different sources, and yes, thank you. I will have to, as I said, close the door, end off, and hopefully see you all in the very near future. Okay.
Thanks,
Bye.
Paul. Bye.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.